Now we'll be looking at the rights of a citizen. What are the rights? What are the fundamental rights of a citizen in a country? When we say the rights or the fundamental rights, we mean they are natural and God-given privileges. Rights are natural and God-given privileges that every human being at birth is entitled to. These rights are recognized, entrenched, and protected by the Constitution. When we talk about rights, we are saying that by virtue of the fact that one is a human being, once you are born, they are natural and God-given privileges that every human being at birth is entitled to. So these rights are recognized, entrenched, and protected by the Constitution of most countries. Hence, it is the duty of a state to ensure that these rights are protected. So what are the examples of the rights of a citizen? Number one is the right to life. Number one is the right to life, which is the first, because upon these rights, the other rights rest upon. This is the foundation of all other rights, the right to life. If a person is dead, there is no need for the enforcement of his rights. So it's only a living person that can enjoy these rights as a citizen of a country. So number one is the right to life. This is the most important of all others. It's the foundation upon which the other rights rest upon. Number two is the right to fair hearing. Is the right to fair hearing. If somebody has been accused or is bringing an action against another person, he has the right to fair hearing before a court of competent jurisdiction. So the right to fair hearing is number two on the list of our fundamental rights. Number three on the list is the right to ownership of property. Every citizen has a right to the ownership of property, and property cannot be deprived without any reason. Of course, these rights have their limitations, which we are going to look at very soon. Number four is freedom of association. Number five is freedom of movement. Number six, freedom from unlawful detention. Number seven is freedom of religion. You have a right, you are free to practice any religion of your choice. Number eight is the right to vote and be voted for. I would like us to take a quick look at some of the limitations of these fundamental rights, limitations of citizens' rights. What are some of the limitations to each of these rights? Because most times people have the misconception that they enjoy these rights, each of these rights, without any limitation whatsoever. But that is a very wrong presumption. For instance, a person can be deprived of his right to life by a judgment of a court, by a court's judgment, if he is found guilty of a capital offense like armed robbery, where a person, a citizen, is found guilty of a capital offense, is found guilty of a capital offense. So a person can be deprived of right to life by the judgment of a court where a citizen is found guilty of a capital offense like armed robbery. The punishment is death. A person can be deprived to his right to life. The right to ownership of property, a person can be deprived of such rights if government wants to compulsorily acquire the property for public use. So, when emergency situation arises, ownership of property, compulsory government acquisition. So by reason of compulsory government acquisition, a person can be deprived of his rights to property, but of course the person will be compensated by the government. Government can compulsorily acquire a person's property for public use. Then, for the freedom of association, the fact that you are free to associate, to join any association, this fundamental right only has its limits to lawful assembly. So, when you talk about freedom of association, please bear in mind that the law only permits a person to be a member of a lawful assembly. For instance, if a person becomes a member of a cult group, if you join any cult group, there will be grave consequences because the law frowns at such assembly because of their evil aims and objectives. So, when there's the freedom of association protected by the Constitution, it only limits its protection to lawful assembly if a person or a citizen of a country joins and becomes a member of an unlawful assembly like a cult group or a secret society, such a person can be punished very severely. So when we talk about the fundamental right to freedom of movement, looking at the freedom of movement, the limitation is that a person cannot trespass on the property of another citizen. So the fact that you have a right to movement does not mean that there is no limitation to your right of movement, freedom of movement, but you cannot walk into or trespass into another property where there is a restriction of movement for security reasons, especially when there is riots, when there is curfew, when there is any social unrest, when there is elections, during the election period. Movements are restricted in Nigeria. So in such a situation where movement is supposed to be restricted, if a person decides to say, oh, today is the day that I want to enjoy my right to freedom of movement, then it becomes an offense. Because the Constitution protects the freedom of movement does not mean that there are no limitations to the freedom of movement. One of such limitations is trespass to the property of another, the private property of another. The second is where there is restriction of movement for security reasons, where government has placed an announcement to say, oh, you are not allowed to move within this time and this time. For instance, in situation of unrest, you discover that government may restrict movement and say, okay, from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. So outside that time, if anybody decides to move around, it becomes a criminal offense. So as much as each of these rights are protected, they are fundamental to human, they are our God-given privileges, they also have restrictions. So when we're talking about the freedom from unlawful detention, that means the person cannot be detained beyond 24 hours if he's charged for an offense or a suspect of a crime without being taken before a court of competent jurisdiction within 48 hours. So in a police custody, under normal circumstances, a person ought not to be detained beyond 24 hours. Number 7 is freedom of religion and the right to vote and be voted for.